Adrian Daniels, partner. Both Guy and Adrian were with us in February here in Tel Aviv, and I'm hoping soon the world will go back to normal and be able to be with us today. Today we have participants from 39 countries around the world, a number of large corporations, investors, and startups, so it's very exciting. Access Innovation is based in Tel Aviv. We work to connect some of the most advanced technology startups with global investors, and we work with some of the world's largest corporations, including Ford, Visa, and Kimberly-Clark, and we'll be very happy to talk to you about the work we can do to help you find innovative startups in different places. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Guy with us, who will give us the initial comments, followed by my colleague Jason Weiss, who will then kick off the investor panel with Guy. So Guy, thanks for joining us today from London, and looking forward to hearing a great webinar. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Ed, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, I guess, to people. It's a pleasure to be here. So we can, I think someone else is going to run through the slides for me, so we can start off with slide number 1. I'll just wait until I can see that. I think I should be seeing it somewhere. Can't see it just yet. So just waiting a second to see that. Here we go. Okay, so, so yes, it's a pleasure to be here. So as you know, we're going to talk a little bit about how behavioral science can play a part, a constructive part, in both the investment process, but also to a certain extent the business creation process as well, and to see how those two parts can come together. If we just move forward a slide, as a quick introduction. My name's Guy Chambliss. As Ed just mentioned, I'm a professor with IE University in Madrid, specifically part of the School of Human Sciences and Technology, where I teach master's programs on innovation and the application of behavioral science. Alongside that, which is the case with the bulk of the faculty at IE, we also have normal jobs, so to speak, and in that capacity, I'm a remain advisor to a US-based energy and behavior startup called Levy. Probably not a startup anymore. They probably wouldn't like me saying that, scale up. I'm also the co-founder of a company called Greener Hours, which is also focused on consumer behavior around energy consumption and carbon here in the UK. And then I also run my own, where we work with clients to help apply behavioral science and potentially to improve products and services and employee engagement, etc. So if we can have the next slide, it's, Ed gave me very strict instructions in these 20 minutes to not major too much on COVID-19, because I think we've all had sufficient exposure to it, if that's the right word, and have seen 1,001 webinars on COVID-19. But I feel compelled to say something about it purely from the behavioral science point of view, because behavioral science has been so central, certainly in many countries in Europe, to the response to this, both in terms of curtailing and reducing our behaviors, but also in terms of what may happen subsequently. So the little example I want to give you is to do with ground, which you can see in front of you now, London. And there's a very interesting study that maybe gives us a glimpse, both in terms of how complex behavior is and actually how bad is going to happen in the coming weeks and months. But maybe behavioral science can give us some insight there. And this is very, very relevant to both COVID and also the conversation we're having more broadly, because of the types of behavior that we're looking at. Now, in 2014, there was a strike on the London Underground, on our metro service. It only lasted 2 days, and it was a little bit, some parts of the network for 1 day and other parts from somewhere else. And what was interesting is, as a result of this, of course, no one could use the underground. So that behavior was immediately stopped. Now, bear in mind, this was a 2-day strike. So the behavior wasn't stopped for that long. And I'd say it's worth thinking about those 2 days in the context of how long the lockdown has been going on. It's starting to come off a little bit now. Now, after those 2 days, when the London Underground opened up again, what they were very surprised to see is that the commuter footfall did not return to the levels it had been prior to the 2-day strike. So in other words, even though the behavior was stopped because of the strike, once the strike was removed and the behaviors could go back to their natural levels, they didn't go back. And this is very interesting. It's interesting for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's because we all know when we commute to work, we are in what we call a patterned habitual behavior, that we are just getting on the tube every morning or getting on the metro or whatever it may be, because that's just what we do. And that is the process. And habits are very, very interesting, because what happens with a habitual behavior is that whilst we're initially motivated to engage in that behavior because it helps us meet a goal that we want to achieve, which in this case is getting to work, period of time, the behavior is context in which it happens. So it's 7:20 in the morning, I'm walking past the coffee shop, I know, etc. That actually the behavior becomes far more factors than it does on trying to meet the goal, which is getting to work. And what happened in the case of the London Underground strike is that for years, potentially, people were still going through this habitual behavior of getting on the tube to go to work. It was only when there was a disruption for 48 hours in which they realized that actually that behavior was no longer meeting the goal to do, which is to get to work, or to get to work in the most efficient way possible. In other words, people started to discover that it was a lot easier to walk to work, or get on a bus, or get on a bike, or maybe even not even go to work at all and work from home. So this is a very vivid little case study, because, as I say, it was a 2-day lockdown in effect. And that lockdown in itself created a friction in the behavior, which revealed that a huge proportion of that behavior was no longer fit for purpose. And the behavior never snapped back into place once the lockdown, in this case a strike, was removed. So if I can have the next slide, I think that the interesting thing from this little case study is that actually we make huge assumptions about the motivation that our customers in a B2B context, or our consumers in a B2C context, we make assumptions about what the motivations are for those behaviors. Probably accurate if we think about what that motivation was initially, but in time, if that behavior becomes habitual, then actually it's no longer the motivation that drives the behavior, it's the context that drives the behavior. And that has a huge implication for us, because if for some reason that context changes, if we introduce friction or barriers or load in that process, the behavior can slip away very, very quickly. So yeah, this is my first point, is to say that actually, motivation may not be what we think it is. And if I can have the next slide, if we carry that belief, the question we can ask ourselves is enough view of how our customers and our consumers both behave and will behave, and what the motivations or the drivers are for those behaviors. Because as that little example is given, actually quite often behaviors can betray the underlying motivations quite a bit. In fact, they can be completely divorced at times, and only under certain situations can we, unfortunately, divorce has taken place and the behaviors collapse as a result. And obviously that is a question that is floating around right now for a lot of companies, in terms of, even once the lockdown, as a result of that. And so that's the end of my COVID conversation. But it's an interesting little case study, because it is starting to do the rounds in terms of trying to predict what may happen to behavior as the lockdown comes off. And there is one story which I'll save until the very end, because I think it's another interesting slide. I want to give you another example of how we are potentially not particularly good at predicting. And this one involves, now, the world, it seems, is divided into two groups. There are those people who eat popcorn when they go to the cinema, and there's those people who don't. And what's interesting is this particular paper did a study of looking at how that behavior manifests itself and how it can change, in that they took a group of people into a cinema and they had people that typically would buy popcorn and people that would typically just go and watch the film. And they gave both groups free popcorn, put them into the cinema, and they observed what they did with the popcorn, and they spoke to them afterwards. And as you'd expect, everyone was very happy to be given free popcorn for a movie. They then did a second version of the experiment, which is interesting, whereby they again had a group who were popcorn eaters, habitual popcorn eaters, and a group who were not. And again, they gave both groups free popcorn, but this time the popcorn was stale. So it was old. So it didn't taste good at all. And they put them into the cinema and they watched them and they spoke to them afterwards. And what was interesting is that those people who are not habitual popcorn eaters took one mouthful of the popcorn, or maybe a couple, realized it didn't taste very good, and they left it. And they also reported that behavior. They reported the fact at the end, so well, the popcorn didn't taste any good. The habitual popcorn eaters ate the popcorn. Okay, they finished the popcorn, but afterwards they had no problem with the popcorn. Even this is interesting because in a similar way to the underground story, the behavior of eating the popcorn is no longer meeting a goal. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that even though the popcorn was stale, the individuals carried on eating because they're in the same context. It was in a cinema, I've got popcorn, I'm going to keep eating it. They then did one final version of the experiment, whereby, again, they had those people who were habitual eaters and those who were not. And they gave them stale popcorn again. But this time they asked everyone to eat the popcorn with their non-dominant hand. So if you're naturally right-handed, we want you to eat it with your left hand. Now, what does that do? That introduces a little bit of additional friction in the behavior because I'm not used to eating it with the other hand. Now, the results from this one are interesting. As you can imagine, the people who are not habitual popcorn eaters still hated the popcorn and still left it. The habitual popcorn eaters didn't eat it either. They then decided not to eat the popcorn and they reported it didn't taste very good. Now, ostensibly, this is the same group of people as in the previous version. Suddenly, the popcorn tastes different as a result of this little bit of extra friction being put in. In other words, having to eat the popcorn with the other hand. And again, it reveals this very interesting fact that actually a tiny change in the context here fundamentally changed how the individual behaved in that particular context. And if I can have the next slide, this is the second point that I wanted to make, that actually very small changes, or that they're certainly very small changes to us, at least, in either the environment or the context or the experience, can cause significant changes in these target behaviors. We may think these are inconsequential changes that we're making, but we can see dramatic shifts in behavior as a result. And in this particular case, it's again because of it being habitual behavior. And whilst you might think, well, that's a very particular type of behavior, do remember that actually for the bulk of businesses, what we want to see is habitual behavior from our customers or our consumers. And the reality is that habitual behavior makes up the vast majority of the behaviors we're engaged in anyway. So if I can have the next slide. The reason that I think this is so relevant is also, we mentioned this when I was in Tel Aviv in February, that actually, I'd have an assertion that actually it's not technology, it's behavior that disrupts markets. In other words, you can have the best technology in the world, you can have the best solution, and if your customer or consumer doesn't react behaviorally, doesn't respond behaviorally to that solution, it doesn't really matter what you've got. Okay, it's ultimately behavior that causes the disruption. And I think it's not a question of semantics. Actually, when you start to think about this, you do start to look at the business in a slightly different way. And if I can have the next slide, here are three companies which we all know exceptionally well, and to a certain extent, we'd say with all three companies. But if you start from a behavior point of view, you also start to recognize that they are behavior companies, that actually they have fundamentally disrupted their markets because they've shifted consumer behavior in this case. In the case of Uber, if I can have the next slide, I'm sure no one will be particularly, and if any of the investors here have a position with Uber as well, I apologize. But this is linked to Uber, I think. Hear me out for a second, in the sense that for some of us on the call today, we'll be familiar with these small stenciled flies in the urinals. That fly is there to, think of the most diplomatic way to say this, to improve the aim of those using the urinals. And they've been proven to be hugely successful, much more so than signage and messaging about the cost of cleaning the urinals. I think this fly was first tested, or the fly concept, I should say, it's not the same fly, in Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, and they reduced the cleaning costs of their washrooms by 80%, simply because the accuracy of the user went up as a result. Now, why is this relevant to Uber? Because one explanation of this, a behavioral science explanation of why this fly works so well, is because it activates what's called the gaze heuristic. In other words, that we like, especially men, like the idea of trying to predict the travel and the arc and the trajectory of an object. And so in this particular case, there is an inbuilt desire to try and hit the fly. Why is that relevant to Uber? Because I don't think Uber would work nearly as well as it does if it wasn't for the map and the moving car on the map. That actually this, in effect, activates the gaze heuristic amongst users, and it becomes a thing that people want to watch, they want to engage with. Is the map really critical to the proposition? In many respects, no, it's not. It doesn't actually fundamentally damage the proposition itself in terms of getting the flexibility and the price and without having to pay there and then with all the tipping challenges of a normal cab. But this is a feature which I would argue dramatically drives the performance of Uber. So let's get off urinals or out of urinals. If I have the next slide, and I think you can see similar things with Netflix, for example. Netflix potentially invokes loss aversion, which is our dislike of losing something, by having the autoplay on the next episode. So it's no longer about you making a decision to watch the next episode. You have to make a conscious decision not to watch the next episode. And that hurts us more. We've enjoyed it, we want to stay with it. And Airbnb, interestingly enough, if you have a good host photograph, okay, then that host's property gets booked out more often and at a higher price. And why would that be? Well, it's because we know that actually there's something called the halo effect. And if I look at a good photograph of a host and I like the look of them, I'm going to like their property more, I'm going to trust them, I'm going to trust their property more. So with all of these companies, and I think you could probably find examples in many, many more, I would say that it's interesting to look at it from a behavior point of view rather than from a technology point of view, because it reveals something about why the company is successful. But also it reveals something else. If I can have the next slide, I think it forces our attention to go somewhere else, because we can say that actually quite often successful innovation can live in what we might think are peripheral aspects of the proposition or the experience. In other words, the things we tend to focus on from a utility point of view, from a business point of view, actually may not be the things on which it hinges for customer and consumer use. But the fact that they are peripheral, I think, is a good thing, because it means the opportunities to be distinctive, to outcompete, are much greater, because we have more levers to pull. We have more opportunities to look at. We have more corners to explore where we can actually find these peripheral aspects upon which the whole customer or consumer experience could be dramatically different. And yes, a lot of this does point more towards a B2C environment, but we must remember that even in a B2B environment, we are still talking about humans buying and using products and services. And so many of the lessons, most of the lessons from behavioral science are applicable across the two. So if I can have the next slide, just going into the last little couple of bits. Whilst I'm here, I wanted to also talk about money. Money is an interesting one from behavioral science, because it tells us that when we are asked to pay for something, or when we are being paid for something, our behavior changes in ways that you wouldn't ordinarily expect. It's not simply the fact that actually being asked to pay for something puts a uniform drag on my willingness to engage in the experience or to buy the product or service. It is a far more subtle, far more complex relationship we have with money. There's one very famous case actually from Israel of a daycare center where they were getting very frustrated that parents were picking up their children late from the daycare center, and it was getting later and later each day. And the daycare center were incurring costs because they're having to keep their teachers in their carers in the school for a little bit longer. So they decided, okay, we're going to start charging for this, and this will stop people doing it. We're fed up with people abusing our goodwill. So they introduced a measure whereby they said, you get the first 5 minutes for free. After that, there is a charge for every 5 or 10 minutes that you're late. And their expectation here was actually this would stop people turning up late. As you can probably guess, it had completely the opposite reaction. The market, in effect, was created here for paying to turn up later. And so parents started rocking up half an hour, 45 minutes or an hour later, because they thought, I just have to pay for the privilege now of being able to come in later. So money didn't work there at all. Similarly, when we have any behavior that has any altruistic or pro-social element to it of helping other people, if you introduce money, it really distorts the behavior. If you have low blood donation rates in your country, and you think the way to get more people to donate blood is to incentivize them financially, less people give blood. Now, why is that? It's probably most likely because we give blood because we think it's the right thing to do. Yet if I'm now going to get money for it, I'm now questioning what my motivation was to give blood in the first place, and I simply walk away from the behavior. So again, if I can have the next slide, there are many other examples of that we could talk about, but I think it comes back again to this same question. Do we feel we have a good enough view of our customers and our consumers' behavior and actually what's driving them? Next slide, please. I think the answer to that question, though, can be yes, of course. Behavioral science is a fast-growing field. The applied behavioral science field is growing faster still. There are ways that we can now bucket together clusters of behavioral science insights, and this is a model that I use, but where we have these 5 areas, identity through to reflection and investment, where we say, right, there's a whole group of psychological levers at play just here. We understand how these work. We understand the situations in which they often manifest themselves. Can we now apply those areas to the established and existing processes that companies use? So, for example, around customer journey maps, for example, that's a growing area now where we say, well, actually, what does behavioral science tell us about how the customer will work its way through this journey map? How will the whole experience from beginning to end with the company, how can that be made better through the application of behavioral science? And the similar process can be done more broadly around innovation. In other words, can we use behavioral science to de-risk innovation? Can we use it to understand earlier if we're going down a blind alley or we're making assumptions that simply won't hold? And if I can have the next slide. And I think it's very important to stress, that if one does adopt this sort of behavioral science strategy, on the investor side, this does not take the place of intuition. Okay, it does not take the place of the extensive, well-developed experience, the gut feeling that investors often have. It's there to support it. It's there to potentially find red flags, and it can be there to say, actually, maybe your intuition at this particular moment should be tempered with a little bit more science. So it doesn't at all take the place of it. It's there to support that process. And on the entrepreneur side, there is no fear that the logic of the science should replace the magic of being an entrepreneur. Again, it should be there if it's used correctly, if it's applied correctly. It's there to drive the creative process. It's providing visibility, headlights, whichever way you'd want to see it. Is to basically see the terrain more clearly, to be more confident about that. So, going on to my next slide, please, and this is where I'm going to wrap up. I said I was going to come back to this case of where it really draws into sharp focus the fact that actually we often chronically mispredict human behavior. And there was an interesting final piece to that story whereby they saw that the foot traffic onto the underground during commuter times did not get back to normal. And if I have the next slide, which is my last slide, what they found is that actually that drop in users was not uniform across the city. They found that there were patches around London where people did not come back onto the tube. And interestingly enough, those patches are those parts of the city where the tube map, which is stylized, where the actual true distances between stations were not accurately shown on the tube map. In other words, when you look at the map, and I think it's the same with most metro maps in the world, they've spread out the stations so it actually looks nicer and you can actually read the name of the station, etc. The reality is if you actually look at the physical distances between the stations, the map looks very, very different. And what they found is that in places where the tube map chronically overestimates the distance between stations, it was those parts of the city that saw the lowest, the greatest number of people not coming back to use the tube as a result. In other words, what was very clear is at the very beginning, people had taken the decision to use the tube because they hadn't realized the distances involved, and they felt that actually the tube was the best way to meet their goal. Ultimately, the tube map revealed that actually that wasn't the people didn't come back. On that's my time up. I'll hand back to Jason now for the next.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Guy. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jason from Access Innovation. I'd like to move on to the second part of our webinar. This was a fantastic, really insightful way to kick things off. Thank you, Guy. Let's take what we've discussed right now and really dive in with our investor panel. We're really excited to have everyone here. First, we have Adrian Daniels, partner at Eagle, our known law firm, sponsor and a great partner of Access Innovation for many years. We have Francesco from Alchimia Investments, Stephen Levy from Unorthodox Ventures, and Ibar from In Capital. So I'd like to just pass the mic over to each of you to give, let's keep it to 1 minute introduction of who you are, what you do, and then I'll pass it to Guy to moderate this Q&A with investors about behavioral science. So how about we go in the same order? Adrian, Francesco, Stephen, then Inba. Let's see.
There we go. Hi, my name's Adrian Daniels. First of all, thanks very much, Guy. That was, as always, a fantastically interesting lecture, and has made me rethink all the things I wanted to say, all the things I thought I was right about, I think I'm now wrong about, all the things I thought I was wrong about, then perhaps I actually have been getting right. Anyway, I'm Adrian Daniels. I'm a partner in the Israeli law firm of Yigal Aronon. We're one of Israel's largest law firms. We're a one-stop shop specializing in all areas of commercial law. My particular area of expertise is in representing technology companies and in investors. So I'm getting some feedback. Is that me? Is that myself? That ends myself. And I represent investors in investment in technology companies, both investments and mergers and acquisitions, and both domestic and international clients.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Guy, for the amazing presentation. My name is Francesca Russo. I'm Italian-based venture capitalist, and I have been representing Alchimia Investments as a head of investor for the past 3 years. We've invested all around the world in technology companies, both on the B2B and B2C side. What we like is, of course, technology at the core, so the ability to impact the industries, especially in Italy, where we bring back a lot of the companies we invest in to make sure they can work together with the big companies and corporates in Italy, as well as the sort of institutional landscape.
Hi, I'm Stephen Levy. I'm from Unorthodox Ventures. I'm a partner there. We are a family office, but largely do VC-style investing in early-stage startup companies. We're largely focused on consumer B2C consumer product companies. We invest globally. We have an investment in Israel, a second to come shortly. We are looking actively in Europe, and several investments in the US. And Guy, similarly, a lot of what you said and spoke about resonates. I'm happy to we'll talk about it as we get into the Q&A, but really resonates strongly with a lot of the things that we look at and how we invest.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm involved with In Capital Ventures. We're an early growth stage VC that operates between Tel Aviv, Toronto, and New York. I'm currently based in New York, as you can see. We invest in Israeli-related companies and mostly in B2B companies with solid traction in North America. We focus on helping our portfolio companies expand into the US market, and we invested so far in 4 companies and very active even in COVID days. And thank you for the fascinating presentation, Guy. Super interesting.
Okay, I'll pass it back over to Guy. And I also want to remind everyone watching from all over the world to submit any questions you have to Guy or to the panel at large. We're going to save a few minutes for questions. So it's a great opportunity to really dive in anything you want to know. And you can also use the chat room to introduce yourself, say where you are, where you're from. With that, I'll pass it back on to Guy to start the session with the investors.
Okay, thank you, Jason. Yeah, welcome everyone. So I know we've got a good spread here of both sort of B2B and B2C between you. And I'm looking at the way that everyone's arranged on my screen. So to keep my small brain working, I'm going to go in that order, if you like. And so I'm going to start with Francesco, but this is going to be a question that's going to come to a few of you. I mean, the question, current screen, I mean, if you're prepared and able to discuss this, I should mention, what does your current screening process look like in terms of understand if the market, if and how the market is going to respond to a product or service that you're looking at? So that's the question. What does your screening process look like? Does behavioral science feature in that? And I'm going to ask that first of all to Francesco.
Thank you, Guy. So that's a very interesting question, because the base of our screening process is actually to try and maximize objectivity and take away a lot of our sort of impressions away from the decision making. Of course, you know, when it comes to the actual decision, and after we have analyzed all the potential analysis we've made, it's interesting that most of the times actually sort of more personal impressions and more impressions, especially on the team, come out of the decision, come in and become actually an important part of it. Now, as far as the market assessment, when we look at sort of B2B companies, as I said, we tend to interact with large corporates in Italy or in Europe to make sure that they would have interest in services offered, such as the one offered by the company we're looking at. When it comes to actually B2C, what we try and do is actually create a small panel of people, including ourselves, to try and test what the solution is. Again, what you said is very interesting, because going back to the screening process, our approach is to try and be as objective as we can. And we don't even realize, but actually, you're right. At the end of it, it goes back to our impressions and our sort of and the behavior that the team has expressed during the time of analysis.
Thank you. I mean, obviously, Francesca, you do both, so that's interesting. And I'm going to come back in a moment to sort of find out whether actually that shifts slightly if you're thinking, primarily B2B or B2C. But Stephen, you're a B2C man, and I'd be interested to know how your response differs from Francesco's, considering your focus is somewhere different.
Sure, and it's kind of funny because I would describe the way we look at it almost differently, which is we kind of start out very intuitively. We see a product that we think is interesting. We often, with the things that we invest in, are something that we try. We go into a store and we see something that catches our eye, we try it, or we have an issue and we'll go to, we're looking for the solution. We go to the web and search out. We say, this seems interesting. And then from there, intuitively, we say, hey, there's an interesting opportunity. From there, we actually do research. So we're very, our team is largely made up of former business operators. I'm actually the only deal guy, start deal guy on the team of 15 of us. And so one of our team members, actually his functional role previously was as market research. So we'll then go and do market research. and we'll do primary market research. So we'll go and send out surveys to people and do that type of analytical work. So we actually start with intuition, move to data collection, and then we will also look at, you know, what's the size of the market, what's the market opportunity, and those sort of macro analytics. So we'll do macro analytics, micro analytics, and then ultimately come to a decision about whether we think something's interesting. So we kind of start off a little bit reverse from what it sounds like Francesco's process is, which is interesting.
Okay. It is interesting, and I'm going to ask an obvious question now, and it sits well with Inbar. So I mean, Francesca, you had a balance there between a little bit of sort of intuition and gut feel, balance with trying to be as objective as you can. Stephen, you've given the impression that actually you start at least with something which is much more sort of intuition driven. Inbar, do you think that washes in a B2B environment? Does that carry as well, or do you think that actually that is, you need to do it differently if you're looking at a B2B environment rather than a B2C?
So I think it's a bit different. In B2B, the advantage that we have as B2B investors is that we can speak with customers. We invest in companies that already have product market fit. So for us, a very big part of the due diligence process focuses on that aspect and on getting that feedback from the ground, from the customers, understanding if there is an actual need for the product, if they solve a real business problem, if the product is sticky, how likely they are to stop using the solution in, let's say, in times like COVID. Many businesses rethink their budget, and some of the services are services that are very sticky, and they will keep using them no matter what. And some of them are services or solutions that they're likely to give up. So trying to really understand what is the problem that they solve, how big of a problem is it, talking to them about the entire process, from integration, how easy it is to use. So we collect a lot of data points, both from the market side, so we do our market analysis, but also from the ground, talking to customers. And this is really helpful for us to better understand the product. And in many cases, we learn that what we thought is the actual use of the product proves to be a completely different use. So we focus on the use cases as well, and how the customers are using the solution. It's a bit different in that sense.
I think an interesting point you bring up there then is you're saying that actually sometimes you find out that actually the use case is not what you anticipated. And that, I suppose, in a way forces you potentially have to change your mind, really. And I wondered how that, again, Adrian, I'm going to come to you in a second because I've got a very specific question to ask you, but just to stay on this theme with the other guys for one moment. Is it okay to change your mind, basically? Because, you should have the right to do that, but does it, well, how easy is it to do that? Francesca, to you first of all, and does that in any way imply or suggest that you're less sure of your screening process and the decisions you're making?
No, I mean, when I talked about the sort of testing with customers, whether they're consumers or B2B customers, I think that's the part that normally, it's a bit of a node of directions, of different directions, and actually we like to be surprised sometimes, hopefully more in positive terms than in negative terms, but like to be surprised by feedbacks coming back, extremely positive, or just neutral, and the questions also is not only about necessarily the the feedback yes or no, but it's more about nuances that sometimes not only allow you to not only allow you to take a different direction, but to rethink at the problem differently. And I think that's the most important feedback that we can receive, because normally, you know, we are market people, we see a lot of different markets, so we tend to understand what's the overall direction, but the nuances, you know, really make the difference in investing. And, you know, we've seen several deals falling off on our table, which we were very convinced and very proud of, because, you know, the market was giving us, you know, a different perspective. So that's something we appreciate a lot, actually.
Right. And Stephen, to you, I mean, obviously you've just said that actually intuition plays, I'm not going to say it plays a more important part, but it certainly plays an earlier part in your decision process. Does that result in you having to change your mind more often if you're relying on intuition earlier?
I don't know if it changes more often, but we've definitely had cases where we've been excited about opportunities, and then we've gone in and done our work. And I think similar to the way Francesca described it, that we've gone in and done our work, and then we said the solution may not be as good as we thought it was, or we were looking at a dental product as an example where we weren't sure about the ability. You know, it's a double sale. You have to sell to the healthcare professional, and then you have to sell to the customer. And that creates its own challenges. And so that's an example where there was a viewpoint where we might have been able to sell it to the customer, but we weren't sure if we could penetrate easily into the healthcare professional part of that decision-making process at the market level. So we had to figure that out as we went through our diligence process. So I think, you know, that's why you do due diligence, right? Is to try to figure out if you are making a good decision or not. So.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned there about sort of the excitement, and sometimes you said, well, actually, maybe, yeah, we're not, maybe that excitement has to be tempered. I mean, that's a good lead into, Adrian, a question for you in terms of, as someone who sits in the middle of this process, potentially, between investors and those who own the company or those who created the company, what role do you see for, and I'm not going to call it behavioral science, I'm going to call it more an understanding of human behavior for what your role is in that, in terms of trying to, I guess, in effect, take it from the beginning to the end, because I mean, there can be no guarantee, and I'm sure it falls over. I have no experience in your world at all, but it strikes me there's probably a lot of soft social science already baked into what you do alongside the legal side of it. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how do you to incorporate applied psychology, behavioral science into your process.
Right. I mean, it's thanks for the question. I've never considered what I do to be, you know, applied psychology, but certainly I think there's an awful lot of applied psychology when you take a look from 30,000 feet that I'm involved in. I think, you know, if you take any particular transaction, or you take any particular company and any particular investor, and you were to just feed what the goal of a transaction, or what the goal of a company, or the goal of a VC would be, you put that into a computer, the result that you would get would be X. But of course, because, you know, we have the interference of agency of human beings in that process, they don't often get to that point, the point that should be the optimum transaction, the optimum purpose of the company. And so often my role is to try to navigate helping a client, whether that client is a VC or whether that client is a company, get to where it should get to, rather than where the client thinks it ought to get. And part of that process will be, and this is where I'm now second guessing myself based on what you said earlier, I try to identify the motivations of the agents involved. So, you know, when you say, you know, you have a VC involved in a transaction, now the motivations of the VC will be comprised of its LPs on the one hand, which have a particular set of goals. They want to limit the risk. They want to get as much information as they possibly can. You may have the aspect of the general partner itself may have a completely different set of goals, particularly when they're looking at raising a fund in the next year or two, what their kind of appetite for risk. And you have to kind of tease out how those motivations may affect the ultimate result that everybody actually wants to get to, and help each party within that transaction understand what is probably best for them, even if that's not what they initially recognized to be the best outcome for them when they began the process.
Interesting. I mean, I don't know whether you know that there's a, and I'm probably going to give a very simplistic response to this, but the orange sharing exercise, which I think comes out of Harvard, where they basically put an orange in front of pairs of students and say, you have to find, you're both given a reason you want the orange, and you have to find a way to share the orange in the most constructive way possible, where both sides get what they want. And it's an interesting, it's held up as an interesting example of collaborative decision making. Actually, both halves want the orange for very different reasons. One wants the juice, one wants the rind for something. And unless there's some discussion about what you want from it, they end up basically cannibalizing value for both sides, because they just slice the orange down the middle, or they refuse to give any ground, etc. And I think it's said because it's probably fair to say that the applied behavioral science scope is widening now. That probably 3-4 years ago in the marketing domain, and increasingly now it's being used in terms of understanding team dynamics, team negotiations, how organizations can work more effectively internally, rather than actually sort of where they actually sort of meet the market. So I think a lot of what you described there is playing out in the market, playing out in the applied behavioral science market as well. I'm just looking at time, and I want to ask a couple more questions to the, oh yeah, sorry, Stephen, yes, you want to make
Guy,
a point.
I was gonna your conversation now just really touched on one thing that I think relates, which is one place where I would say intuition still rules, at least for us, and we've discussed about how to make it more scientific, is in assessing the management, assessing the entrepreneur / management of the company. I would say, at least for us, it's still very much an intuitive process. We've discussed, you incorporate something like the Myers-Briggs or one of these other analytical tools that people use. But that, for me, continues, I think, for our firm, continues to be one of the most intuitively oriented parts of the decision-making process, because at the end of the day, that's a big part of the bet, is, are you betting on the right people? And it's hard to make that scientific.
It's an interesting point, and I think there is a sort of sub debate, if you like, within behavioral science that actually there's almost a sort of subtext that actually, I'm hesitating because I don't believe it, and I think a lot of people who know the literature well would say the same thing. But when it gets carried across into an applied field, there's a belief that actually what behavioral science does is it basically reveals our frailties because of our reliance on gut feeling and intuition. Where actually, when you actually go back to the literature and you actually look at who's doing the research in the area, the recognition is, of course, that intuition is a profoundly powerful decision-making tool. It shows you, it gives you an ability to basically filter out a huge amount of noise, what might be completely random sort of outliers in the data, if you like, and actually make a much more informed decision. So I think it's an interesting one where if an applied behavioral science consultant comes to you and says, behavioral science will just basically strengthen your decision making because it takes away the need to rely on intuition, I would tread incredibly carefully on that, because I think you run the risk of damaging one of the most important capabilities you have within the business. I wanted to ask one more question to you, because I think we've got this time for that, and it's really based on what we've talked about today. And one of the points I wanted to make was the fact that actually sometimes success or failure can sit in what feels like what initially may have felt like an inconsequential, fringe, peripheral, unimportant bit of the proposition. Are you prepared to sort of come out and give us an example of a good or a bad case where that played out, in the sense that whether you were completely broadsided, you were completely caught off guard by what looked like a great proposition in principle, but it turned out there was some reason it didn't work? Or similarly, were you incredibly pleasantly surprised, Francesca, to use your language, where actually something became far more successful than you anticipated? And specifically, whether you can identify, was that down to one particular aspect of the experience, whether it's B2B or sort of B2C? That's Inbar, can I start with you? I'm going to go the other way around for this last question. Yeah. So any great examples, good or bad, where you think actually behavioral science could have helped you, I guess?
Sure. First of all, the discussion around intuition is really interesting, and I'll connect it to your question. I think in most cases, at least in my case and the way our team looks at investments, we have that initial, when we initially evaluate a company, we have an idea of what the product is like, how it's being used, and what use cases, what problem it solves. And then when we continue our due diligence, we look at the data points and we try to understand if that supports our intuition or not. In many cases, we find out that it does support our intuition when initially evaluating the company. In other cases, it's completely, we're surprised, and we find out that either the product has different uses, or we think as investors we've seen enough, and we all have experience. I'm like Stephen, I'm mostly the deal person. My partners are operators, so we come from different angles, and we kind of combine all of our experience trying to evaluate. To your question, in many cases, we learn that either the company needs to change, to pivot to a different course of action or perspective, and these things are discussed with the team. We were in one case, we thought that the product was not, that the product market fit was not good enough, and eventually decided not to go through with the deal. In other cases, with one of our portfolio companies, we learned that the company was really able to pivot to where they should, and grow and adapt to the market needs. One of our companies, for example, our recent investment in Wellness Living, is an operating system for health centers, for wellness clubs, and during COVID, they had to completely change their strategy and to adapt. People didn't go to gyms anymore, and the situation was obviously very extreme. But they were able to really find a way to provide their service to customers, and to provide virtual plan that was able to eventually solve that issue. So yeah, in this case, we were surprised. We had a good surprise of a company that was able to pivot and to better understand the market need.
Okay, thank you. And Stephen.
Sure. So I'll give you a quick anecdote. One of the investments we made, and this touches on your, I won't say it as nicely as you did, but it touches on your urinal theme. You have that nice British accent to say it. I have to say it in my New York accent. But we invested in a bidet business, and there's two interesting things that come out of that. One, the founder of our firm had an operating business that he ran for many years, and he sold. When he sold to the management transition, he'd always been a big fan of bidets because he just thinks it's a better solution. It actually is a better value proposition for the user. In America, there are obviously countries and markets where it's fairly well accepted. In America, it historically has not been. His business had been in Lexington, Kentucky, which is not what you would, it's not the coastal cities where new trends generally developed. When the new owners came in, they were discussing taking them out, and he had put them into all the bathrooms for all the employees because he just thought it was better. The new owners came in, they were going to take them out of the bathrooms, literally, and particularly the male employees said no way. They literally threatened a strike if the bidets were removed. So talking about intuition, where you would say, gosh, guys in Kentucky, let's say to Kentucky, who would want to use a bidet? And we, they found out that that was actually something very serious. Now, the second part of that story, so we, that was before our firm was established. We make an investment in bidets, and who would have thought that that COVID would have led to a huge shift of people all of a sudden getting excited. And I don't know if people followed, but there were numerous news stories as a result of toilet paper. And I exactly to your example of friction. Friction was caused because people couldn't get toilet paper. So they literally had to find alternatives. And there was a huge surge in bidets, not just for our company, quite frankly, but for all of them. And people said, hey, let me try this alternative, to the point where a lot of companies were actually sold out. You couldn't get, just the way there was a shortage on toilet paper, there was a shortage on bidets. And so for us, it was great. It turned out to be a good thing because it accelerated. Well, we were excited about it because we thought there's an opportunity to educate the market about a better solution, and this kind of accelerated that education and that trial for something new. But it plays into a couple of your points about intuition, of both where you would have had intuition that it played different from the intuition, and then in a spot where, I mean, we were excited about it, but we wouldn't have thought about COVID actually having direct impact. And again, fortunate for us, it did have positive impact for us.
So I need to jump in here. We are almost at 5 o'clock, and I want to keep everyone here because we have some great questions. So it's okay. We're going to jump in a few questions we had from the audience. And so this first one, I want to shoot back to Guy, and we'll try to answer as quickly as we can to get through a couple of them. So this is a question from Rob in Scotland, and he asks about using behavioral science to luxury or nice to have goods. And this is something also we've already touched about in B2B space. When you're selling something, it has to be a needs to have it. And Guy, what would you say if it's something that's a luxury or nice to have? How do you try to incorporate behavioral science into that?
Well, very briefly, I think there are two things there. One, I think if you're trying to sell it into a company that makes luxury goods, behavioral science has a huge understanding of emotion and what we call high involvement decisions. So, if you look at why someone buys a 7 Series BMW, for example, there's a lot you can unpack there. So I think it's just as applicable in what we call high involvement decisions around luxury goods as it is around buying a tube of toothpaste. If Rob's question is also around whether companies see it as a luxury rather than a nice to have capability, I would say that actually right now, almost every business decision that a business is thinking about is a decision around behavior in terms of coming out of COVID. So I would say it's not a nice to have at all. I think it's a fundamental requirement of every strategic decision businesses are making.
Okay, great. Another question from Dogan from Turkey, that we also spoke about intuition related to entrepreneurs. Stephen, you brought up this idea that at the end of the day, you have to have that intuition. So it brings up an interesting case we all know about Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos, which was a fraud. So how do you evaluate, and this maybe each of the investors could give a few seconds to elaborate on this point, do you apply personal assessments? Is it worth, in your opinion, Guy, bringing on an expert in this area to do that kind of personal evaluation? How do you look at that to the investors? And then Guy, what is your take about that personal assessment for early stage investors? And maybe I'll pass this to Inbad first, and then we can all answer and end with Guy.
By the time we invest, we have a long interaction with the team, and we focus on evaluating their personalities, how they interact with each other. We use experts' opinion more when it comes to the actual market, the solution, but when it comes to the team itself and personalities, we use our own perspectives for that, and it's really based on interaction with the team.
Francesco, anything to add?
Thank you. Yeah, sure. We like to think it's a small word, and many times it is. So, first of all, as Inbar said, a lot of interactions. I mean, they probably spend with us more time than they spend with their respective partners or kids until we invest, and for the months of due diligence. And secondly, we always like references, and most of the times we also like to test in the single market whether our trusted people know them directly or indirectly. So that's another good way to test sort of new friends coming into the house.
Okay, great. And Guy, do you have anything to add about this idea about early assessments of people? Is it really about intuition, or how can behavioral science be used at this early evaluation stage?
I can understand the attractiveness of it. I'm very doubting of most of those mechanisms, those actual sort of devices, processes, in terms of actually what they actually reveal. In the case of Theranos, I would say that the bigger question of analysis there is actually looking at the behavior of the investors as much as Theranos themselves, in terms of that desire to, the fear of missing out, the whole FOMO effect, I think, was probably a huge part of that. So I think I can understand why people would want to run those sort of psychological assessments. I'm not overly trusting of them in terms of the quality of the outputs they produce, is the honest answer.
Jason?
Yes.
Sorry, I just want to carry on from Guy's comment. I think if anything, the interest in behavioral science would have in something like that would be in the whole sort of herd theory of why it is, that the investors just follow on the tail of different investors. So you look at WeWork, and people will just pile on because, well, if it's good enough for SoftBank, it's good enough for us. And investors start to kind of lose their objective abilities their abilities to objectively assess, and they kind of abdicate that responsibility to a sense of, well, if everybody else is doing it, then I want to do that too. And certainly, I would think that a behavioral science tool that could warn against the kinds of behaviors that lead to that, or the kind of indications that lead to that, would be very useful.
Fantastic. That's a really interesting point. So I'll go to, I think, our last question. We'll see if we get one more in. And this is from Maria from Munich, as well as in Helsinki. And she wants to dive in, I think, Guy, you can take the lead in this, on emotions. So what role do the emotions play behind our decisions as consumers? And maybe I'll add, how can consumers perhaps be more aware of what's being done when they're being marketed to in these kind of situations?
Okay, so very briefly, it's a great question, and the truth is, yes, actually, emotions are often seen as being sort of, people tend to think that they betray us. They tend to think they cause us to make poor decisions. The reality, well, I can't say the reality. There is, overwhelming evidence that says that actually emotions are a critical component of our decision making, both in a B2B environment as well as a B2C. By the way, if you've ever made a decision where you've chosen one law firm, like Adrian's law firm, over another because the reputation of his firm is very good, well, guess what? You're making a decision based on an emotional response to it. In other words, you place a lot of weight in the reputation of his business. So emotion is incredibly important, and actually it allows us to make faster and quite often better decisions. But to Maria's point, yes, the trick with that is obviously we've developed very good emotional responses when we think we're in what we call benign situations where no one's trying to game us or play us. And the truth is actually a lot of the time that if you know that's the way we make decisions, you can cause people to make decisions that are against their best interests. So it's probably, there's too much to say about the second part of it. I'd be very happy, Maria, to give you a longer answer offline, etc. But the short answer is emotion is incredibly important and valuable in how we make decisions. Okay,
we got a lot of questions. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to them all. We will perhaps connect people afterwards. Feel free to shoot us a message. My email is jason@accessinnovation.com. We have going to have a recording of this webinar on our YouTube channel, and also a summary about it in the coming days. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us from all over the world, almost 40 different countries. Thank you to Guy, Dr. Chambliss, for giving this presentation, sharing these fantastic insights. To Adrian and Yugal Arnon for sponsoring this, and for, in general, just being a great partner to Access Innovation and to the entire startup ecosystem. To Francesco, Inbar, and Stephen for joining us and sharing our insights. We hope you all enjoyed. Stay tuned for our next webinar and our next activities. We are also organizing a virtual roadshow to Russia, virtually, with Russian investors and corporations in the middle of July 14th and 15th. So any Israeli startups out there interested to present, you'll find more information on our website. That's it for today. We're sorry we took you over a couple minutes, but I think this is well worth everyone's time. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your evening or morning.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.